Hi, I'm Arnie Skelton, and each week in this podcast series, I'm going to offer you my top 10 tips on particular topics or themes that might be of interest to you as a teacher or manager or both. Hi, and welcome to this week's podcast, which this week is about learning how to learn. So it may have particular relevance for you if you're a teacher and want to get the best from your students, because if they can learn effectively, then that certainly helps them achieve what they need to achieve whilst they're with you. But it may, of course, just be relevant to you yourself in terms of your own learning style. How do you learn best? So this may be relevant for your learners or for yourself. So here we go, my top 10 tips on learning how to learn. And tip number 1 is to find out if you have a learning style preference or blend. Do you know how you learn best, or have you simply become locked into a way of learning that you've always used? It's something that a lot of people just don't consider. Do I learn in a particular way that's effective for me, or do I simply go about learning the way I've always gone about learning? So what I'm suggesting with tip number 1 is that we work out how we learn best. And so tip number 2 is to start with Gardner's learning style inventory, his 7 key points about people's preferences for learning. And although it's not been entirely well reviewed these more recent years, it is something that I think is quite useful as a starting point to consider what your particular preference or blend of learning styles might be. So just to quickly recap Gardner's learning style preferences, they are word, logic, visual, movement, auditory, social, and self. I'll say them again. Word, logic, visual, movement, auditory, social, and self. So word preferences suggest people like reading things, very comfortable with text. Logic, people like to know the connections between things. They like to see how things work. Visual, people have a very good way of recalling things as images. Movement, people like to get up and moving around, don't like sitting while they learn. Auditory, they're very good at hearing things like music or rhythm or tempo. Social, they like working and learning in groups. And self, they like learning on their own. They like to work through things for themselves. So I don't think Gardner was ever saying, and I don't think anyone would be saying now, that anyone is stuck with any one of those 7. It's likely that people have a predisposition to a blend of one or more of these particular learning preferences. So the point really is, check it out. Consider whether or not any one of these 7 or a combination of them helps or hinders your learning. Tip number 3 is that, staying with Gardner's learning inventory, it's worth actually accessing all 7. It's worth being comfortable and developing your skills in any of those 7 particular styles. And the reason is that in the real world, no one gets to be given their learning style preference. People lecture, and so it's good to be able to hear the words and have strong auditory recall. But sometimes people are good at memorizing things through pictures, through images. So people will not always be given access to the style or preference or blend that suits them most. So it's quite good to be able to learn how to learn in any one of those 7 preferences. So tip number 4 is, in order to do that, keep trying something new. So give yourself a little test every now and then. If you have something you want to learn, see if you can recall it visually. See if you can work out a logical connection between the points you want to learn. See if you can create a limerick or a rhyme or a poem, and so on. In other words, give yourself the opportunity to test out each of the 7 learning preferences on a particular learning project. It doesn't have to be big. It could be you want to learn, I don't know, how to memorize something, which we covered last week. Try different ways of accessing whatever you want to learn through all 7 filters of Gardner's learning styles. And tip number 5 is translation. Now, this is one of my personal favorites. If you do have a preference, then if you've been given what you require to learn in a different format, in a different way, then translate it. Translate it to the way that works best for you. And my own personal favorite for this is translating word to visual. I'm reasonably comfortable with all of these learning styles, but I have a preference for the visual. If something's presented to me visually, I can recall it much more easily. So I know I am visually cued, I have a visual strength for learning. But a lot of the learning I need to access is written. It's in books, it's in textbook form. So I almost always convert what I'm hearing or reading into some kind of visual map. So as I hear it and or read it, I create a visual of it. Last week when I did my memory podcast, I talked about learning a number of random items by creating a storyline, and that storyline for me would actually be visual. I could picture the story happening in my head. So whenever anything is presented to me visually, it always helps. And if it isn't presented visually, I just create a visual for it. Of course, it can work the other way around. You know, if you're given something visual to learn, but you're strong with word, then you write something that you will make more sense. I just want to give you a little story about this that makes it very, very powerful. I was asked by someone to help them with some learning, and they were studying for a finals exam, and they had a book to learn, in their view, which is the size of a telephone directory, and they were really despondent because they just couldn't learn all that information presented as it was in text form. Very dense, word after word after word. But I noticed she'd attempted to use a highlighter pen to focus on one or two things, which suggests that she likes colour and that she is cued by visual reminders. So I asked her if she had any idea what a mind map was, and she hadn't. So I showed her a mind map, and I said, let's have a look at one of the pages you really have to learn and see if we can create a mind map for it. And we did. It only took a minute. And she was blown away. She said, it was like a light bulb going on. She said, that's terrific. I'm going to do that. And she sent me an email 3 months later saying she'd got a distinction, and she felt that the only reason she got the distinction was that she'd used mind maps to create a visual of all the key information points she wanted to learn. So it can make a tremendous difference. So it's about really opening up to different learning strategies to find the one that works best for you, and if it's not given to you immediately, then translate into your preference at every opportunity. Tip number 6 and tips numbers 6, 7, 8 and 9 are about 4 other factors that really affect how people learn. And tip number 1, of course, is motivation. We're always going to learn better if we're motivated, which means we're interested in either the subject or the way in which the subject is presented. So tip number 6, tap into people's motivation if you're a teacher, and for yourself, find a motivation to help you learn. Tip number 7, if you're lacking motivation, and it's not always possible to be motivated by what you have to learn, then tip into commitment. Make a promise to yourself to stay committed to the learning. Excuse me. That means take ownership. Don't wait for motivation to appear or to suddenly arrive. Give yourself a commitment to learning. So for me, commitment is probably more important than motivation. We often have to learn things that we're not necessarily motivated to learn. And when that happens, I find that I switch from motivation, which isn't there, to commitment, which can always be there because it's personal and it's owned by me. So I think a key feature for successful learning is to develop commitment, to take ownership of your own learning. And that leads really to tip number 8, which is about staying focused. If you want to be an effective learner, you need to stay focused. You need to be able to concentrate in the moment on the learning. It won't automatically arrive, and it may well need your level of concentration to be high in order to be effective. So tip number 8, stay focused. And tip number 9 is about timing. Timing is a key feature for most people's learning in 2 ways. Firstly, how long can you stay focused as a learning activity? What's the size of your learning chunk? Can you stay with it for, say, an hour and a half, or are you better off in 10-minute chunks? Work it out. If you've got some ownership of when you learn, then how chunked is your learning time period? Can you stay focused for half an hour and then need a break? Or are you better with 10 minutes and then a quick break and then another 10 minutes? And how long is the gap between each of your chunks of learning? Can you just, learn something for half an hour and have a 5-minute break and get straight back on it? Or do you need an hour or so break? So learn how chunking helps you best to learn. And the second timing issue is the time of day. Are you a morning person, an afternoon person, an evening person? When, during the day, are you most effective as a learner? You may need to experiment with all these things, but it's worth working them out in order to find out when works best for you. And finally, tip number 10, convert learning into learned. That's learning spelled ing at the end into learned spelled ed at the end, which is all about converting what you've learned into real understanding through application and practice. Learning that just stays in the head can't just be demonstrated. To me, it's learned ed when you're able to demonstrate it by applying it or showing that you can practice it. So tip number 10, convert learning into learned. So those are my top 10 tips for learning how to learn. Quick review. Do you have a learning style preference, or do you simply carry on learning the way you've always learned? Tip number 2, check out what your preference or blend might be by considering Gardner's learning style preferences. Tip number 3, it's worth accessing and developing your skills in all 7, because the world won't always provide you with a learning requirement entirely suited to your preference. Tip number 4, try something new. Do things differently just to access different ways of learning. Tip number 5, translate. If you receive what you need to learn in one unhelpful style, translate it into a style that works best for you. Tip number 6, the first of 4 of the factors, motivation helps. Tip number 7, if you lack motivation, turn on your commitment. Tip number 8, stay focused. Learn concentration devices and skills to help you stay focused. Tip number 9, work out what timing suits you best, either the size of your chunk that allows you to learn or the time of day that works best for you. And tip number 10, convert learning into learned through application and practice. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. And remember, if any of these ideas or podcasts help you or work best for you, I have a website called www.effectiveconnect.co.uk, which contains a lot of this information in easy to access formats. So that's www.effectiveconnect.co.uk. Thanks for listening. Bye. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, make sure you subscribe. You will still get the podcast for free, but you will also get an alert to let you know when the next podcast is available. And please recommend the podcast to anyone else you think might like it and benefit from it. Also, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a review and any other comment, because they'll help promote the podcast series on the relevant platform. So, bye for now.